Chapter 1. The Great Collapse. The world had changed. It had been a gradual process, one that had taken decades to unfold, but the impact was undeniable. The age of fossil fuels had come to an end, and with it, the world as we knew it. It had started with the oil crisis of 2020. The price of oil had soared to unprecedented levels, and the world's economies had ground to a halt. The world's governments had been caught off guard, and they had scrambled to find a solution. They had invested in renewable energy sources, but it was too little, too late. Over the years, the world's dependence on fossil fuels had only grown. The demand for oil, gas, and coal had far outstripped the supply, and the world's economies had become addicted to cheap energy. The world's governments had tried to mitigate the effects of the crisis by introducing rationing, but it was too little, too late. As the years went by, the effects of the crisis became more and more apparent. The global climate had become increasingly unstable, and natural disasters had become more frequent and more severe. The world's economies had collapsed, and many countries had descended into chaos. But amidst the chaos, there were pockets of hope. People had begun to embrace renewable energy sources, and communities had come together to build a new world. It was a world without cars or planes, without central heating or air conditioning. It was a world without the conveniences we had taken for granted, but it was also a world where people had learned to live sustainably and with respect for the planet. One of those communities was the town of New Hope. It was a small community nestled in the foothills of the Rockies, and it was one of the few places in the world where people were thriving in the post-fossil fuel era. The people of New Hope had embraced renewable energy sources, and they had built a community that was self-sufficient and sustainable. But even in New Hope, life was not easy. The winters were harsh, and without central heating, the people had to rely on wood-burning stoves to keep warm. The summers were hot, and without air conditioning, the people had to rely on shade and natural ventilation to stay cool. The town's food supply was limited, and the people had to grow their own vegetables and raise their own livestock. Despite the challenges, the people of New Hope were happy. They had built a community that was based on mutual respect and cooperation, and they had learned to live in harmony with the natural world. They knew that they were living in a world that was vastly different from the one their parents and grandparents had known, but they were grateful for what they had. As the sun began to set on another day in New Hope, the people gathered in the town square. They sat on wooden benches and listened as their leader, a woman named Rebecca, spoke. "Today marks the 5th anniversary of the collapse," she said. "It has been a difficult journey, but we have made it this far. We have built a community that is sustainable and self-sufficient, and we have learned to live in harmony with the natural world. But there is still much work to be done. We must continue to build a better world for ourselves and for future generations. We must continue to live sustainably and with respect for the planet. We must continue to have hope." The people of New Hope nodded in agreement. They knew that their journey was far from over, but they were ready to face the challenges that lay ahead. They knew that they were part of something bigger than themselves, something that was greater than the sum of its parts. They knew that they were part of a new world, a world that had emerged from. Chapter 2. A Visitor from the Outside World. The people of New Hope had settled into their new way of life, but they had never forgotten the world before the collapse. It was a distant memory, but it was a memory that still haunted them. One day, a stranger arrived in New Hope. He was a man in his 30s, tall and thin, with jet black hair and piercing blue eyes. He was dressed in a black suit and carried a leather briefcase. He introduced himself as Alexander and said he had come from the outside world. The people of New Hope were suspicious of outsiders, but welcomed Alexander nonetheless. He was given a bed and food and was invited to join the community. He seemed like a polite and well-educated man, but there was something about him that made the people of New Hope uneasy. Alexander spent the first few days in New Hope observing the community. He watched as the people tended to their gardens, raised livestock, and worked on crafts. He seemed fascinated by their way of life, but he never participated in any of the community's activities. One day, Alexander approached Rebecca and asked to speak with her privately. They walked to the edge of the town where they could speak without being overheard. "I need your help," Alexander said. I come from a city outside of here, and we desperately need resources. Our people are starving, and our infrastructure is crumbling. We need fuel and food, and we need it now." Rebecca listened to Alexander's plea, but she was skeptical. She knew the outside world was dangerous, and she was hesitant to get involved. But she also knew that the people of New Hope had a responsibility to help those in need. "We will help you," Rebecca said, "but we cannot give you everything you ask for. We have our own needs to consider." Alexander nodded. "I understand," he said. "Anything you can give us would be greatly appreciated." Over the next few days, the people of New Hope gathered supplies to send to Alexander's city. They packed crates of vegetables, cured meats, and handmade goods. They also packed barrels of biodiesel, which they had made from the crops they had grown. Rebecca pulled him aside as they were loading the supplies onto Alexander's truck. "You have to promise me that we'll use these resources wisely," she said. "You have to promise me you will not exploit our generosity." Alexander looked Rebecca in the eye. "I promise," he said. "Thank you for your help." And with that, Alexander drove off into the sunset, leaving the people of New Hope to wonder what kind of world awaited them beyond their community. Chapter 3. The Betrayal. Several weeks had passed since Alexander's visit to New Hope, and the community had returned to their routine. But something was different. The people had a sense of unease that they couldn't quite shake. One day, as Rebecca was tending to her garden, she heard the sound of an engine in the distance. She looked up and saw a convoy of trucks approaching the town. Her heart sank when she saw that the lead truck was the same one that Alexander had driven away in. The truck stopped at the edge of the town, and several armed men stepped out. They approached the people of New Hope and demanded that they hand over all their resources. Rebecca stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "We gave you what we could spare," she said, "but we cannot give you everything. We have to think of our own survival." The men laughed in her face. "You foolish little people," one of them said. "Do you really think you can survive in this world without us? We have the power, the weapons, and the resources. You have nothing." Rebecca knew that they were outnumbered and outgunned. She knew that they didn't stand a chance against these ruthless invaders. But she also knew that she couldn't give up without a fight. She signaled to the people of New Hope, and they quickly armed themselves with whatever weapons they had. They stood together, a small but determined group, ready to defend their community. The invaders attacked, and the people of New Hope fought back with everything they had. The sound of gunshots echoed through the town, and screams filled the air. The fight was brutal, and the odds were against them, but the people of New Hope refused to give up. In the end, they emerged victorious. The invaders were defeated, and the people of New Hope had once again proven their resilience and strength. But the cost of victory was high. Many lives had been lost, and the community had been forever changed. As Rebecca surveyed the destruction surrounding her, she realized they could never let their guard down again. The outside world was dangerous, filled with people who would stop at nothing to take what they wanted. But as long as they had each other, as long as they had their community and their spirit, they knew that they could survive. They knew they could build a new world without fossil fuels, a world of hope and resilience. Chapter 4. Rebuilding and Moving Forward. After the attack by the invaders, the people of New Hope knew that they couldn't continue to rely solely on themselves to survive. They needed to rebuild their community, but they also needed to find a way to defend themselves against future threats. They held a meeting to discuss their options, and it was decided that they would form alliances with other nearby communities. They sent out emissaries to reach out to these communities and build relationships based on mutual support and defense. It took time, but eventually they had established a network of alliances that spanned several towns and villages. They also developed a system of communication and trade, sharing resources and skills to help each other thrive. As they worked to rebuild their community, they also focused on finding new ways to harness energy without fossil fuels. They experimented with wind turbines, solar panels, and hydroelectric power, eventually developing a sustainable energy system that was both efficient and environmentally friendly. They also focused on education, teaching their children about the dangers of the outside world and the importance of community and sustainability. They wanted to ensure that their way of life would continue for generations to come. Years passed, and the people of New Hope continued to thrive. They had built a new world, one that was sustainable, resilient, and supportive. They still faced challenges, but they faced them together, with the strength of their community behind them. Rebecca looked out over the fields of crops and the houses that dotted the landscape. She felt a sense of pride in what they had accomplished, but she also felt a sense of responsibility. They had built this world, but they couldn't take it for granted. They needed to continue to work together, to support each other, and to defend their way of life against all threats. As she turned to head back to her home, she felt a sense of hope. They had survived the collapse of the fossil fuel industry, and they had thrived in a world without it. They had proven that a new way of life was possible, one that was sustainable, resilient, and full of hope. Chapter 5. The Return of Alexander. It had been many years since Alexander had betrayed the people of New Hope and left with their resources, and they had long since given up hope of ever seeing him again. But one day, he returned. At first, the people were wary. They remembered the betrayal and the pain that Alexander had caused, and they weren't sure if they could trust him. But Alexander had changed. He had been traveling the world, trying to make amends for his past mistakes, and he had seen the devastation that the fossil fuel industry had caused. He had come to realize that the only way forward was a sustainable and community-driven way of life. He approached Rebecca, his head bowed. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said. Chapter 6. A New Beginning. Rebecca looked at Alexander, studying his face. She could see the remorse etched in his eyes and sense the sincerity in his voice. After a long pause, she spoke. "Alexander, we cannot change the past, but we can choose how we move forward from here. We are a community built on forgiveness and second chances. We welcome you back, but you must earn our trust." Alexander nodded, grateful for the opportunity to make things right. He spent the next few years working tirelessly alongside the people of New Hope. He used his knowledge and expertise to help them improve their sustainable energy system, and he also helped to build stronger relationships with neighboring communities. As time passed, Alexander became an integral member of the community. He had earned their trust and proven his commitment to the sustainable and community-driven way of life they all believed in. Together, the people of New Hope continued to thrive, building a world that was sustainable, resilient, and full of hope. They had faced incredible challenges but emerged stronger and more united than ever before. Years turned into decades, and the world around them continued to change. But the people of New Hope remained steadfast in their commitment to sustainability and community. They had proven that a better way of life was possible and became a beacon of hope for others. Rebecca felt a sense of peace as she sat on her porch watching the sunset. She knew that the future would hold its own challenges, but she also knew that they were prepared to face them. They had built a community that was built on trust, resilience, and hope, and they were ready for whatever the future held. She smiled, grateful for the journey that had brought them to this moment. She knew that they had created a new beginning, one that the collective strength and spirit of the people of New Hope would sustain.